So that's possible. It's possible that I'm lying or self-deceived or confused or genuinely not experiencing it due to some sort of conceptual defect. Or it's possible that it goes the other way and that there's something off about the phenomenology of the realist. It could go either way. And this is why I think cognitive science, neuroscience, bringing in evolutionary considerations, all of this stuff is going to be very, very essential to adjudicating this dispute between realists and anti-realists. And it seems wild to me for people to not be interested in that or not care or not think that that's relevant.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Lance Bush. He is currently pursuing a PhD in psychology at Cornell University, and his research focuses on moral psychology, metaethics, I guess the psychology of metaethics as well, and methodological issues in experimental philosophy. Viewers may remember him from the discussion he had with Eric Sampson on the channel a few weeks ago. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Lance.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I wanted to, you have this very interesting article on understanding folk metaethics. The article is actually called Misunderstanding Metaethics, Difficulties Measuring Folk Objectivism and Relativism, co-written with David Moss. And just as a kind of overview of why this sort of stuff is relevant, because people might be asking or thinking like, why do I care, like, for thinking about metaethics, what folk beliefs are about metaethics or anything like that, or folk psychology? So I guess the first question is, how might this be relevant to moral theorizing? And second, maybe what other relevance could this have?
Right. So there's a few ways in which it could be relevant. The most straightforward way is one that's related to a sort of burden of proof style of argument that's pretty common among moral realists. So typically, one of the things that some moral realists will do is they'll say that basically the burden of proof is on moral anti-realists, which are people that reject the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts. There's different ways of carving up the realism, anti-realism distinction, but that would be one of the common ways that there's the anti-realist denies that there are any such thing as mind-independent moral facts, and they might deny that for a variety of reasons. So what a realist might say is they might say, look, the common sense view is that like torturing babies for fun is objectively wrong. It's stance independently wrong. And this is what most people think when people go around making moral judgments. That is a part of what they're doing. They're making these claims about what's stance independently true. And so if you want to say that anti-realism is the correct account of morality, the onus is on you to make a case for that. So, for comparison, this would be similar to someone making a kind of like Moria move where they're like, look, like I've got hands, they're right here. So if you want to argue there's no such thing as hands, you better have a good case, because the default position is that we have hands. So it's somewhat similar. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, and like if you were to formalize it or something like that. But the basic idea is that certain kinds of positions have a claim to being the sort of default position against which rival positions have to make a case. So that would be one reason why it would be relevant if it turns out, like the empirical case turns out to be that most people are in fact moral realists. Because if they're not, you no longer get to make the claim that it is the common sense view. The common sense view is actually going to, be predicated on what people actually think when you ask them or when they think about these issues. So that would be one thing, is the sort of burden shifting onto the anti-realist. Another way that's a little more complicated, and I don't know that how much we really want to get into it, would be related to how we determine like what the referent is, like what is the subject matter that we're talking about. So, you know, what if someone says like witches don't exist? Well, what do they mean by a witch? Do they mean like a sorceress with supernatural power that could transform into a cat and fly around on a broomstick? Well, those don't exist. But if witch talk in the 13 and 14, 1500s had referred to those witches, but then like ones with magic powers or whatever, and that consult with demons, but gradually over time came to refer to something else, like mean old ladies or something like that, then like those exist. There are mean old women. So then it would be referring to something that is real. It's just it no longer has those original properties. So if you want to see a really good article about this, what I would recommend is Don Loeb's article. Let me see if I can get the name. I think it's called Moral Incoherentism: How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat. It's a really cool title. I don't even know if I got it exactly right. But this is a major point that Loeb stresses in there, which is that like it actually is important to figure out what people mean when they're engaged in moral discourse as such, because if it turns out that what philosophers are talking about in academic papers and academic work on moral philosophy, like, you know, quote, moral philosophy, they're not even describing how people ordinarily use these terms, then they're talking about a different subject matter than what is like the colloquial speech. And we need to like make note of that because it matters. You know, if I went around saying dogs don't exist, people would find that very strange. But if it turned out by dog, I meant something very specific that wasn't like, you know, canines, like if I showed you a dog, like I'm not talking about these, I'm talking about something else, that would be misleading. I would be talking about a different subject matter, but using terms that appear to be about the thing I'm talking, that most people would think that I'm talking about, but I'm not actually talking about it. So if it turns out philosophers are using terms and concepts in ways that are importantly different, like not just superficially different, but different in ways that actually matter, then it might be that when they're talking about whether there are moral facts or not, that they're not talking about the things that every day, like when Joe down the street says murder is wrong, if it's not related to that, then what even is the subject matter? What are these philosophers talking about? So that would be another concern. How specifically and like what particular ways that would matter for philosophical arguments is going to be difficult to sort out. But at least one of the implications of this would be whether or not any particular theory that a philosopher is putting forward is in a certain sense sort of accurately describing how people think, or if it's proposing some sort of revisionary account. Like here's a proposal for how I think we should think about this. And that distinction is an important one because there's a big difference between trying to have like a successful conceptual analysis or figuring out what is in fact true about people's terms, about people's concepts, or about the nature of reality, and a different project, which would be saying, hey, let's all, like I'm proposing, I'm not saying this is true, I'm saying let's all agree to use certain terms or to think in certain ways in order to achieve one or more benefits of whatever kind. Those are just different projects. And one of my concerns with a lot of philosophical work is that philosophers often, I think, are not entirely clear on whether they're offering an account of what is the case or what ought to be the case or something else. It's not always clear what exactly their goals are. And unfortunately, a lot of philosophical papers don't even seem to like explicitly reflect on this and make clear what their goals are.
Yeah, very good. Those are good points. And I guess a potential third thing, though, is that another potential relevance is that a lot of metaethical theories often include a sort of semantic thesis. So yeah, in that way, yeah.
Yeah, so I can build on that because this is a problem when people, you know, I just had a conversation about this week where someone basically asked me what my anti-realist perspective was, and I said, I don't think there's stance-independent moral facts. And they said something like, okay, but like which one of the anti-realist positions do you subscribe to? Are you an error theorist, a relativist, or non-cognitivist? Now, if you look at those positions, so the error theorist would say something like all first-order moral claims are implicitly committed to one or more claims that are false, and that therefore those types of judgments are systematically false. That might sound really weird, but it would be something like if someone thinks this: all moral facts are facts about what God wants. Well, if God doesn't exist, well then if someone goes around saying like you shouldn't get an abortion, and what they mean by that is, abortion is inconsistent with the will of God, well, that's false because there is no God. So it's not inconsistent with the will of God. And so if all of their moral claims implicitly were statements about what God wants or doesn't want, then all of those claims would be false. It wouldn't be that they're true or false relative to that person's framework. No, they're all false. So that would be error theory. And the error theory can be, there's like different types of possible error theories that could be based on different things. It could be based on the notion that there are no objective moral facts. It could be based on the notion that like all moral claims presuppose that people have free will, but they don't have free will. So there's different types of error theories in principle that you could put forward. So that's one theory. And I'll mention the other two and I'll get to what the problem is. Relativism is going to be different types of relativism, but roughly it treats moral claims as having this indexical element, where it would be like if I said, I am Lance, that statement, I am Lance, has an indexical element to it, where the I part, if I say it, it refers to me. If you say it, it refers to you. And so the truth conditions for that statement, whether it's true or false, can vary depending on who is making the claim. So the relativist might say something like, if I say murder is wrong and I think murder is wrong, then it's true. But if someone else who doesn't think murder is wrong says that it's wrong, it's false. Why? Well, again, we could sort of translate the statement, murder is wrong, into like, murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. Well, if it's inconsistent with my moral standards, that's true. So if I say murder is wrong and it's inconsistent with my moral standards, what I mean is murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. That's true. So the statement is true. But if someone else actually thinks murder is totally okay and they say murder is wrong, now they're saying something that they're saying murder is inconsistent with their moral standards, and it's not. So what they're saying is false. So it treats claims as having this relative truth value. For whatever reason, people will say stuff like that relativism is self-contradictory, or it's like self-undermining, or it has various sorts of like logical problems. No, it doesn't. Indexical claims are totally normal. We're all familiar with them. This isn't an actual problem for relativism. There are other issues. So if someone says moral claims are true or false relative to your culture, well, what exactly counts as like your culture? So, I grew up in Florida. Is my culture like whatever people in Florida think, or is it what Americans think? Or is it like what's my culture? I don't even know what that, like, you'd have to get real specific, and it could be that it's true or false relative to like different degrees or levels of cultures that get really weird. Anyway, the last one, non-cognitivism. These days, people tend to use this term expressivism, and there's like older versions of non-cognitivism, like emotivism. They aren't very popular anymore. But roughly, it's just this claim that moral sentences, like moral statements, like murder is wrong, are not even in the business of trying to be true or false. That really they might superficially look like they could be true or false. They certainly have that structure of looking like a propositional claim, but actually they're not. So for example, if someone eats a piece of pizza, they go, delicious, just delicious exclamation point. That it wouldn't make any sense to say that that's true or false, but they might say, this is delicious. And if you ask them what they mean by that, they might say, it was an expression of my enjoyment of the food. Now, look at what they said. This is delicious. It looks superficially like a propositional claim. But if you ask them, like, are you trying to assert that the pizza you ate has the property of deliciousness? They might just go, what are you talking about? I was just expressing myself. No, it's just an emotional state. So it's sometimes called this like boo hurrah theory, like specifically emotivism I'm talking about. There's different ways in which moral claims could be non-truth act. This would be one of them, where when you say murder is wrong, what you're saying is most similar to something like murder, murder, boo. It's not that, and that can't be true or false. So, there's other types of non-cognitivism. Murder is wrong could mean don't murder. And so if it's an imperative, imperatives can't be true or false. If someone says, open the door, is that true or false? Well, it's neither. It doesn't even make sense to ask that question. Now, so those are the three theories. So moral claims can be systematically false. They can be true or false relative to a particular system of value, some like sort of evaluative framework, or they could just not be in the business of being true or false at all. Now, notice something about all three of those claims. They're claims about what moral utterances or moral claims mean. And the problem with that is that those are all, there's a few things to say about that. One is, what are these claims supposed to be about? Like, so this is something I frequently ask people when I have discussions about metaethics, and they'll say something like, moral claims are truth act, or they're capable of being true or false. I'll say, which moral claims? Like which ones? And often what I'll receive is something like, oh, well, murder is wrong. Well, hold up. That's like a toy moral claim. That's not like an actual moral claim a person's making. For, to give an example, if I said like, what crimes are you talking about? And someone said like robbing a bank, that is robbing, like the sentence robbing a bank, is that a crime? No. Like what I mean is like the person down the street actually going into a bank and robbing it. That's an instance of robbing a bank. So when I talk about moral claims, that's what I'm talking about, actual moral claims. A person out on the street saying abortion is wrong. That's an instance of a person engaging in moral judgment and making a moral claim. That's an actual instance of it. If I'm talking to a philosopher and they say, well, for example, abortion is wrong, that's like elliptical. They're not even making a moral claim. That's like a toy case. It would be, to me, that sounds as nonsensical as if I said like, I want an account of what dogs are. So what is a dog? And someone says the sentence like, this is a dog, or there is a dog. Like that's not a dog. The sentence there is a dog is not a dog. I want to know what actual dogs are. And it's the same thing with moral claims. I'm talking about the actual claims people are making, not hypothetical ones. Now, if you want to know what people mean when they're making those claims, that's an empirical question. And so one of the issues with a lot of these semantic theses that are built into the structure of metaethical positions is that they have this empirical element to them where they appear to be making claims about what ordinary people mean when they speak in moral terms and think in moral terms. And until very, very recently, there's been almost no empirical research on what people actually mean. The other problem, and this is where I take serious issue with these accounts, non-cognitivism, error theory, and relativism, is they are subject to what Michael Gill calls the uniformity and determinacy assumption. That is, when you say something like moral claims are not truth out, let's say you're non-cognitivist, and then I say, well, which moral claims? And they say, okay, I'm not talking about toy claims. They say, I do agree, I'm not talking about actual moral claims. Those are not truth out. Well, how many? Like which ones? It'd be like if someone said, fruits are bananas. Like, do they mean all fruits are bananas? Some fruits are, like, what do you mean? So if they say moral claims are not truth out, now, presumably they mean something like the primary or central, like appropriate use of moral claims, like competent speakers in the relevant language engaged in that type of moral thinking and discourse, when they make moral claims, intend for those claims or are using those claims in a way that's not truth apt. That does not mean that if someone's like learning that language that they couldn't misunderstand what moral claims mean and speak incorrectly. If I am learning English and I accidentally say, I have a pet god instead of I have a pet dog, it doesn't mean that I think that I have a pet like supernatural being that created the universe. I just mixed up words. In the same way, an account like the uniformity determinacy assumption is the assumption that the central and primary use of the language is, like, say, in the case of the non-cognitivist, not true that. It doesn't mean that there aren't like performance errors, mistakes. It doesn't mean people can't be sarcastic. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be a few like rogue philosophers that deliberately opt to speak in an unconventional way. So it doesn't require 100% of the times anyone has ever said murder is wrong that they meant to say something that's not truth apt. It doesn't mean that, but it seems to mean like most of the time, like 99% of the time, 95% of the time, I don't know what the claim is. Moral claims are not truth apt. What proportion, which ones, under what circumstances? None of this seems to be adequately specified. But at the very least, it seems to be the assumption that the primary or central meaning of those terms is not truth apt. And I just reject that. I don't know if that's true, but there is empirical work. And it turns out, basically what Michael Gill proposes is what's called the variability and indeterminacy thesis. And Don Loeb has argued for something very, very similar. I think it's all in the same volume. And Loeb has made a similar point that when people are making moral claims, those claims might be implicitly committed to, or that person might actually entertain a variety of positions. They might even entertain multiple positions that are contradictory with one another. But setting aside that issue, the idea is not that complicated. It would just be that, when one person says murder is wrong, they might use it in a relativistic way. When another person says murder is wrong, they might be committed to these objective moral facts. When another person uses it, they might be intending to convey it's like just an emotional state. And you could call that interpersonal variability. There's just variation in what people's metaethical presuppositions when they make moral claims. The other one would be intrapersonal variability, which would be that you maybe for murder, I think it's stance independently morally wrong, but for euthanasia, I'm a relativist about it. And I think it's true or false depending on your perspective. Now, there's empirical research supporting both of those. So my concern with, and then indeterminacy, which I think we'll end up talking about more, would just be that people don't have any determinate commitment to either. But that's like a whole thing that I think we'll get into maybe next. Anyway, my concern is that philosophers seem to have presumed that when people speak, that there's some shared metaethical presuppositions that all people, all competent speakers engaged in a particular discourse and a way of thinking have in common with one another. And I just don't see any particular reason to think that that's true. I think it's entirely possible, and I think that we now are getting growing empirical support that either the variability or indeterminacy are going to turn out to be better accounts empirically of what people mean.
Yeah, there's a lot of very good points there. So yeah, because it seems to me like I've often had this thought that like there is this typically unstated assumption in metaethical theorizing that this is what people mean, or we don't even need to think about the meaning of that people have in mind when they make moral utterances and so forth, and we can just go ahead with our metaethical theorizing. And that assumption seems at best unwarranted, and at worst it might just be completely false. And as you want to suggest, the evidence is not really doesn't really support that view at all. So like maybe if you want to talk about briefly some of the findings, some of the things that have come out of the empirical research on how people respond to questions, and then we'll get into some of the methodological issues, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what I alluded to is this growing empirical literature. And what this empirical literature is, I don't even know if anybody's formalized names. So a lot of this, it's a very small area of research. There's only a few of us working in this area. We're like coming up with our own terms because we're like, this is like uncharted territory, which is to me very exciting. But I just refer to it as the psychology of metaethics. Maybe other people did before me. I'm not like laying claim that like I invented the term psychology of metaethics. Who cares? So this field, the psychology of, you could call it the psychology of folk metaethics, but if we survey philosophers, then they're not the folk. So, basically just the psychology of metaethics. So this is a field that's looking at the empirical question of what metaethical stances and commitments, what sort of metaethical presuppositions, beliefs, attitudes, pre-theoretical intuitions. There's a variety of like ways you can cash out what exactly it is that you're measuring or trying to empirically investigate. It's a field that looks at the empirical question of what do people actually think about the nature of morality. Now, there are a variety of different issues in metaethics. So there is this debate about internalism or externalism about reasons, internalism and externalism about motivation. And so there's like different things that you could look at in metaethics, but most of the research has been on, and most of the research I'm interested in is on the question of whether people, like ordinary people, non-philosophers, are moral realists of some kind or moral anti-realists of some kind. And there were a few early papers that looked at this. The first one I could think of that I think was, I don't want to get too much into history because there's some interesting and substantive exceptions to this. But so I'll just start with what I think is the paper that really got the ball rolling and started the whole literature. It was not the first paper on this. And if you ever want me on to talk about like the history of this research, that's like a whole paper all on its own, probably too arcane and boring for most people. But the paper that got it all rolling was Goodwin and Darley's paper from 2008. I think it's called Exploring Objectivism. I can't believe it's one of those things where it's hard to remember the specific title. Goodwin and Darley, 2008. And that paper introduced a couple of paradigms. One of those paradigms kind of dropped off the radar and nobody really uses it anymore. And the other paradigm, by paradigm, I just mean like a systematic method of engaging in a particular type of empirical research. It's like a type of test you would use. That I've come to call, I don't know if I was the first to call it this or other people have called the disagreement paradigm. So the disagreement paradigm is the main paradigm that is introduced in that paper. And what that does is, here, I'll explain how they used it. So what they did is they sit you down, you take in a survey, and you're asked a bunch of moral questions, and you're asked this sort of straightforward normative question, like what your moral position is. They gave these more specific scenarios, but roughly you could categorize them as like, abortion, murder, stealing, lying. So like standard moral transgressions. And then you're asked, do you think this is morally right or wrong? Like, what's your position on this? Like, is it morally in line or not in line with your moral standards? So once you answer all that, and they gave people like non-moral things of various kinds too. So like taste preferences and like factual claims and that sort of thing. In fact, I don't even remember specifically what they asked them in that particular study. Subsequent studies would tend to pair moral claims with 3 other general types of claims, which would be aesthetic and preference claims. So this would be claims about like music and art and food, social conventions. So like, shaking hands or appropriate attire to go to work. And the third one would be like factual claims. And by fact, of course, any of these could be like technically factual. It's hard to categorize this last category, but it's like scientific claims, claims about math, claims about like geography, like, is Canada north of Florida, something like that. So you would get these 4 categories, and those kind of serve not like necessarily just as like control conditions, but the expectation you would think would be that people would tend to be like objectivists, like they'd be realist about the factual claims, that there probably be anti-realist of some kind, like some type of relativist or whatever about social conventions, and probably like aesthetics and preferences. And then the most interesting question out of the group is, where does morality fall in there? So anyway, so while you're taking this study, you're asked all these different questions, and we'll just focus on the moral questions. If you want me to talk about the other ones, there's some really cool stuff about what I call the Caesar soup case, because that one is wild, and that's out of James Beebe's research. Super cool. Anyway, so with the moral question, so you're asked that question, and then what they say is they're like, okay, so we've given this research to previous participants in another study, and it turns out there was someone that disagreed with you about these particular issues. And so, let's say you chose that you think abortion is not morally wrong, right? So then you're told there was this person that thinks abortion is morally wrong. And they say, okay, now, and this is the disagreement paradigm. There's this other person that disagrees with you about this moral issue. Do you think, and I don't remember the exact phrasing they use, it varies by study, but do you think you could both be correct about it, or do you think at least one of you has to be incorrect? So to give a simplified version of this, let's say that you think abortion is okay, like morally okay, and someone else thinks abortion is morally wrong. It's not okay. Can you both be correct, or must at least one of you be incorrect? So if you say you could both be correct, that's interpreted as like non-objectivism, meaning that you don't think that there's an objective fact of the matter that doesn't depend on people's goals, standards, or values about what's morally right or wrong. What you do think, the study is not, it doesn't have the resolution to tell you, but it does mean you appear to reject that. But if you say at least one of you has to be mistaken, that's taken as an indication that you think that there is some sort of objective standard. Well, why? Well, if I say pizza is good and you say pizza is bad, and then someone says, well, hey, Lance, do you think you could both be correct? I'm like, sure. It looks like I'm saying, yeah, this is like a matter of like subjective preference, or we're just expressing our emotions or whatever. There's not like a fact of the matter about whether pizza is good or bad, independent of like my preferences and your preferences, our personal attitudes, the standards of our cultures, whatever. But if I do think one of us is wrong, now it looks like I think there's a fact of the matter. Because if I say, look, at least one of us has to be mistaken, it seems to imply that there's like a single correct fact of the matter. And if there's a single fact of the matter, presumptively, that fact does not depend on your preferences or mine, because it would appear that I think in spite of it being someone's preference, they're still wrong. So it doesn't depend on their preferences. So roughly, what the disagreement paradigm is intended to do by presenting people with a moral disagreement is to figure out, do you think that there's a stance-independent moral fact about this issue, or do you not think that? That's the purpose of the paradigm. So I'll pause there because I said a whole bunch of stuff, but then I can get into what the results were.
Yeah. And so there's this assumption that, as you say, that their answers there are going to be at least a pretty good indication of whether they think that, you know, moral claims generally are objective or not objective. But there's quite a few issues with that, and that sort of inference you want to say. So, like, what are some of the problems with that? The conclusions that are sometimes drawn based on that.
Well, before I get to the problems, maybe I should talk about what they found in that study, or like I guess maybe
Sure.
It would make more sense to talk about the more general findings.
Sure.
The first thing I do want to say is because I'm very critical of this research. So I say that there's problems with the methods, there's problems with the results, there's problems with the way they measure things. There's all sorts of what I take to be pretty significant methodological problems, and I'm not alone in this. So I believe the first person to publish really like substantive and comprehensive methodological criticisms of this type of research was Thomas Pulsler. But there's been other people that have raised substantial concerns about it. Jen Wright has some papers on this where she raises some issues, and they're like really good stuff that she points out. And James Beebe has also raised some concerns. So there's been other people that have made some of these critiques, and Thomas Pulsler even has a whole book. I think it was like his dissertation. Anyway, so Pulsler has done the most published work on this, and it's super cool stuff. So people should definitely check that out. Anyway, so generally what you find, and this is what makes the results interesting. Oh, sorry. And before I say that, like people, the reason I brought up that like I've been very critical and other people have been very critical is that in criticizing this research, I don't mean to say that this is like bad research. Two things to say. First, like, so this paper, Goodwin and Darley, so Jeff Goodwin was like willing to share the data with me, and I got to reanalyze that data. So very gracious and open about the findings and results and concerns with the study. So there is that. And the second thing is that this idea is actually kind of ingenious because, you know, if you wanted to do really clumsy, bad research on folk metaethics, you could just like ask people, do you think moral realism is true or something like that? They're not going to know what does that even mean? Like, that's a bizarre question. So one of the great things about there are actually two great things about the disagreement paradigm. One is right from the outset, it's at least a little bit indirect. It's not exactly obvious what you're asking them. So that's a cool element to it, because if you directly ask people, you can get problems of like demand effects where they're trying to figure out what does the researcher want to think, like what me to say, and I'll say that. And the other thing is that right from the outset, they didn't just ask, like if two people disagree about a moral issue, like without specifying, do you think that they could both be correct or must at least one of them be wrong? Because they recognize people could give different answers to different moral issues. And it turns out that they do, and that's what makes it interesting. So two things, indirect, and they did not presume that people would necessarily have the same moral standard towards all moral issues. Brilliant starting assumption. So this is very cool what they initially did. So I say all that to like as a qualifier for the critical things that I'm about to say about it. This is a cool study. I really like it. Anyway, so now what they find is that when you ask about all these different moral issues, people give different kinds of answers to different moral issues. Now, what they report is that like if you average out their attitudes about all the different moral disagreements, like overall, it leans towards like moral realism, this idea that there are stance-independent moral facts. So what you get is if you ask them about disagreements about the factual issues like geography and math and science or whatever, you tend to get like a very high rate of saying like if someone disagrees with you about this, at least one of you's got to be wrong. Morality is like below that, and then like aesthetics and other stuff is like way at the bottom. It's like people don't really think if two people disagree that one of them has to be wrong. So you could interpret that as an indication that people are like kind of realists, like typically realists about moral issues. And that is what they report. They're like, yeah, people seem to be basically like on the objective side on moral issues. But if you look closely at the data, you kind of get a different picture. And they do say that in the paper, but then they also seem to say people are basically objectivists. So there's, I'm not sure how to square exactly that because they seem to acknowledge both of those things. But what matters is how people respond to the individual moral issues. So take, for example, if you were sort of evaluating how realist or anti-realist someone was about 10 moral issues, and you find that on average, and let's say for the 10 moral issues, like 10 represents like maximum realism and 1 represents maximum anti-realism, and you get an average score of like 7.5. Well, does that mean people are realists about moral issues? It might seem that way because it looks like the average realist score is higher than the midpoint, which would be like, like a 5. Well, maybe we need like 11 points, whatever. People are above the midpoint, and they're quite a bit above the midpoint. So it looks like people are generally leaning towards realism about moral issues. Well, what if when you went and looked at that data, what you actually saw out of the 10 moral issues, and I don't know what the averages of this would end up looking like, but like they gave like a 3 or a 4 for quite a few issues, and then it gave a 9 or a 10 for a bunch of other issues. Well, now, and let's say it's like 5 and 5. Now, half of the issues, they were below the midpoint for responding as a realist, and half of the issues, they were above the midpoint. It's just that they were enough above the midpoint to drag the average up for the whole thing above the midpoint. So now it looks like they're like a 7 for all of the issues, but actually they're like they favored anti-realism for 5 of the issues, and they favored realism for 5 of the issues. So it'd be a little misleading to then say these people are realists about moral issues, like on average. It's true that they're realists on average. It does not mean that they're realists about moral issues. What matters is their response to the specific moral issues. And that's actually what you get when you look at the responses to these moral issues. People tend to be, and they did do subsequent work on this where they looked at the variation. Why are people more of a realist about some moral issues than another? So they're aware of this variation. And the variation is super interesting. Subsequent research on this by Wright and some others has really confirmed that this does appear to be consistently how people tend to respond to early versions of the disagreement paradigm. That is, they tend to give reliably, like most people will give a realist response to particular types of moral issues, and most people will give an anti-realist response to other types of moral issues. One of the major factors that seems to predict whether people will give the realist or the anti-realist answer is the perceived consensus about it. So like everybody agrees murder and genocide and like torturing puppies for fun is wrong. And sure enough, if you ask people about disagreements about that, they tend to say at least one person has to be wrong. But if you take a controversial moral issues like abortion, euthanasia, other sorts of things like that, and you ask people, do both people have to be wrong? They tend to say no. That's a little weird. Like, why would people think that just because we don't agree about the issue that there's no objective fact of the matter? You know, and that's why I could get to the Caesar soup cases, because those are really interesting. So it turns out that if you look at this data, the sort of like straightforward, flat-footed, like just what does it look like if you interpret that, if you look at that data? It looks like people are what Wright calls metaethical pluralists. That is, they adopt one type of metaethical standards for some issues, another type of metaethical standard for other issues. And so that is what you call intrapersonal variation. So variation from the same person with respect to different moral issues. But you also get sort of patterns where some people will like lean more towards realism and others will lean more towards anti-realism, and you could call that interpersonal variation. And the evidence for these, it just pops up in almost every study on the psychology of metaethics. If you use the disagreement paradigm and you ask about a wide enough range of moral issues, then you'll tend to get this kind of result, this metaethical pluralism. And so as it stands, if you just want to look at what the data looks like, it looks like people tend to give those different sorts of answers. People look like metaethical pluralists. But in the past few years, the perspective on that is starting to shift and things have gotten a lot more complicated. But again, I said I look at an absurd amount of stuff, so I'll pause there. If you have questions or clarifications or comments.
Yeah, I do. I do actually want to mention that you mentioned a couple times now the Caesar soup thing, because it's kind of relevant, because one way to potentially understand what's going on here in these cases where people seem to be giving inconsistent responses is that I think this is something you say in the article, that sometimes they might be interpreting the cases involving some epistemic problem. Right? So they might think that when you ask some controversial moral issue, for example, whether both can be right, it might be that they're interpreting it as, well, is it possible that we don't know which one is right or something like that? And that, of course, I want to agree to. And I think to maybe suggest that might be what's going on in the Caesar soup case, where you ask someone, well, did Caesar eat soup on his, like 21st birthday or something? Presumably that's something for which there's a fact of the matter. A great number of people apparently report saying that, you know, people could disagree and both be right. But maybe they're interpreting that question as asking something, well, epistemic rather than factual. Maybe something similar is going on here. So yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I don't know if we talk about some of the extra details in this particular paper. Future papers will talk about this, but I want to mention the person that really helped crystallize this, could be going on in these cases, which is Tyler Milhouse. And he's presented with me at the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, or Psychology, I don't even know the order, Philosophy and Psychology, SPP. We presented on this quite a few years ago, where we talked about this specific issue of these Caesar soup cases and one proposal for what might be going on in those cases. I don't know if it's a general issue for the disagreement paradigm. Anyway, here's the issue. So some of the studies asked about whether Caesar ate soup on his 21st birthday. Some of them asked about whether Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday. In the Misunderstanding Metaethics paper, we talk about the wine examples. They varied it by study, I think, to make it more like, I don't even know what the reason was. Anyway, so here's how that would work. So let's say I tell you, Alex believes that Julius Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday. Sam believes that Julius Caesar did not drink wine on his 21st birthday. Do you think that Alex and Sam can both be correct, or do you think that at least one of them has to be mistaken? So that's the question. That's more or less the question that people are asked. Now, I've asked people before, what percentage of people do you think say they could both be correct? And people tend to go, like, almost nobody, because it's logically impossible for Caesar to have both drank wine on his 21st birthday and to have simultaneously not drank wine on his 21st birthday. It's just, those cannot both be true. Turns out about 45% of people, so nearly half of people, say both can be correct. Now, the straightforward interpretation of that is, in other words, if people are interpreting the disagreement paradigm as intended with respect to that question, that would seem to indicate that half of the people in the world, if these findings generalize to like the world, half the people in the world are like relativists, so they're non-objectivists about historical events. They actually think it could be the case that, like, George Washington both was the first president of the United States and was not the first president of the United States. The dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteor, and they weren't. They're still here, apparently. That's not plausible. It's not plausible that about half of the world's population thinks that, like, historical events both did occur and didn't occur. So, and if you want to say that they do think that, I think that we need to do follow-up research, because that would be an incredible finding, that people are relativist about, like, general facts. Like, imagine people, well, whatever. Anyway, that's not a very plausible interpretation. So then the question is, well, what could be going on? And again, I don't think we discuss it in this paper. I don't even know. But there's one possibility, which is modal operator scope ambiguity. And to illustrate, that's like a really fancy way of saying that when you say, I'll actually just give examples to illustrate both. Let's say I asked you, give me two baseball teams. You know, I'm not good at sports stuff.
The Blue Jays,
Yankees,
I don't know. The Blue Jays.
Yankees and the Blue Jays. Okay, so the Yankees and Blue Jays. So the Yankees and the Blue Jays are going to the World Series. And I ask you, do you think that the Yankees and the Blue Jays could both win the World Series, or must at least one of them lose? What are you going to say?
I know what you're going to say, because it's like possible at one world that one of them lose. It's possible at another world that one of them lose, but it's not possible at the same world that both of them lose, or something like that.
Right.
So where the scope? Yeah.
Yeah, it's exclusive. It's either one or the other can win. It's not. So if I say, can they both win? What I'm saying is, you could interpret it in one of two ways. Now, given your background knowledge, you know it's actually not possible that simultaneously for both the Blue Jays and the Yankees to win the same World Series. So no, one of them's got to lose. But then suppose that I ask you, Alex and Sam went into the kitchen to have breakfast, and there's cereal in the kitchen. Do you think they could both have cereal, or must at least one of them be unable to have cereal? Well, they could both have cereal, because there's no reason to think that if one of them has cereal, the other can't have cereal. It's not like having cereal is exclusionary in the way that winning the World Series is exclusionary. Now, the thing about that is, if I just ask about the World Series or having a bowl of cereal, when you're given that information, you, as like a human that has background cultural knowledge, you happen to know that two different teams can't both win the World Series at the same time in the same way. But in most contexts where there's like a large enough quantity of food available, you'll be aware that both people could have the same food, so it's not exclusionary. And so typically, background information will fill in the blanks for you about whether the interpretation is intended to be exclusionary or non-exclusionary. And that background knowledge resolves the ambiguity for you sort of automatically. If a person knew nothing about baseball and they didn't know that two teams both couldn't win, like it'd be like if I said, could two people both win medals in the same event in the Olympics? Turns out, yeah, because one could win a gold medal, one could win a silver or bronze. So, silver and bronze. So like two people can win a medal, but you may not know that. What if you thought that there's only one medal per event? So that background knowledge fills in how to resolve the ambiguity. So when you ask this question, do you think both people could be correct about whether Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday? What you might think is not, so when you're given that question, if you don't think logically contradictory things can occur, or like that an historical event could have both occurred and not occurred, if you interpreted that question as intended, it would sound like you're being asked a wildly implausible question, like a ridiculous question. It'd be like if I said, hey, do you think that you can have a square that has 3 sides? No, squares have 4 sides. So it's a stupid question to ask me. Like, why would you ask me an obviously ridiculous question? So when you give people that question, what the researchers intend for them to interpret that as is, do you think it's simultaneously possible for an historical event to have both occurred and not occurred? Not a plausible, why would a researcher ask you an obviously silly question? So what people might do that actually are realists about historical events is think that's probably not what you're intending to ask because it's a weird question. So I'll reinterpret the question so that you're asking something more reasonable. So what could you be asking me? You could be asking me, could it turn out to have been the case that Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday, or not in a non-exclusionary way? Could it also turn out that the other person could be right, that he didn't drink wine on his 21st birthday? In other words, because you don't know, could one of the other people turn out to be right? To give a clear example, let's say I flipped a coin and I put my hand down on it and I said, do you think this coin could have landed on heads or on tails? Well, like the way you're going to interpret that is, could it have landed on heads but not tails, or on tails but not heads? You're not going to interpret it as let me see if I could say exactly where, like, you have to figure out what I mean. Could it have landed on heads and tails? No,
could it have landed on heads? Like, fully, you might want to say something like, is it the case that it could have landed on heads and it could have landed on tails?
Yeah,
and
there you
depending
go.
on how you're putting the statement, like, those are two different things. You don't have to infer that it could have both landed on heads and tails for that statement to be true, right?
Yeah, so could it have landed on heads and could it have landed on tails? The answer to that is yes, it could have landed on heads, or it could have landed on tails. That it could have landed on heads and could have landed on tails, you wouldn't interpret that as could it have landed on like both at the same time.
Mm.
So the reason why you would say that is because you don't know the answer. You don't know, because like if I showed you and it landed on heads, well, then you could get into weird stuff like counterfactuals, like could it have landed on tails even though it did land on heads? Well, sure. I don't know if I'm making the point clear with this particular example, but I think the cereal and the Yankees example do illustrate the general issue, which is that whether two things can happen simultaneously or not is going to depend on the particular thing in question. And background knowledge will typically give you insight into which one of those is the case. So this could be going on with the Caesar soup case, where people are taking their background knowledge and they're interpreting the question in a different way than it was intended by the researchers.
Yeah, those are very good points. I think it sounds to me like those are two maybe related but distinct things, right? The first is, does the example in question, is there some background knowledge or something such that the things are known to be mutually exclusive? And the second issue is, how is the statement being understood, kind of modally speaking? Are we asking, is it possible that X and is it possible that Y? Or are we asking, is it possible that X and Y? And those are different statements.
Yeah, is it possible that X and is it possible that Y is different from, is it possible, like the conjunction X and Y? Those are just different questions.
Right.
And if like typically in practice, the pragmatics of the context of the conversation you're in will resolve that in a way where it's completely clear. The problem with these types of studies is that there's no normal context. You're participating in a study. You're not in an actual social situation where there would be the normal sort of rich contextual information that would allow a person to reliably resolve a particular ambiguity in a consistent way. And this is a general problem, I think, with empirical research in the social sciences, where when there are ambiguities or under specificity in a particular study, people have to fill in the blank, so to speak. And if there's no systematic way that they're filling in the blank, you're going to get interpretive variation. Different people will interpret the same question in different ways. And so de facto, it's not the same question. If I ask, do you like going to the bank? And it's ambiguous between a riverbank and like a financial institution, and I get a bunch of yeses and nos, if I get, let's say I got 50-50, would I then say and let's say I thought I was asking about like the bank, like where you get money. Would I then say 50% of people enjoy going to financial institutions? Well, no, I'm not entitled to that assumption at all. I don't know what proportion of people interpret it as a riverbank or a financial institution. So that 50-50 is virtually uninterpretable unless I know what people thought I meant by bank. And this is a general problem with research, which is that researchers rarely bother to figure out how people interpreted the questions they're asking. And so they don't actually know the proportion of people that interpreted the question in the way that they intended, and the proportion of people that interpreted it in some unintended way. And that can be a very serious problem for some studies, because if a substantial proportion of people don't interpret your question as intended, the measure you're using is not valid. It's not in telling you what you want to know. Now, this is not a minor issue. Validity for a measurement in psychology is not optional. This would be like if your thermometer, you're trying to tell the temperature, and your thermometer does not reliably tell you what the temperature is. It'll give you a reading. It's just that whether or not that reading is like 20-30% of the time totally unrelated to what the actual temperature is. You've got a problem if you're trying to track temperature over time, because it might look like there's wild variation in the temperature, and actually that's just variation in your messed up instrument. So if researchers don't have good theoretical grounds for thinking people understand what they're asking them, it is incumbent on those researchers to use enough pretesting and descriptive work, maybe like focus groups, some type of pretesting where you ask people how they're interpreting the questions. But this is like just not really done very frequently. I'm not saying nobody ever does it. It's often not done adequately, and it's often not done in cases where you'd really, really, really want to do it. And that's specifically in my interest is in when it's not done in experimental philosophy, because philosophers, if you take 10 philosophers in a room and you ask them if they're all realists, and they all say yes, does that mean they all think the same thing? Nah. They're the background set of beliefs. Every one of those people could write, if they're metaethicists, could write a book on why every one of their colleagues is wrong. So, like this idea that if people are answering these questions in a consistent way, that they mean the same thing as one another, this isn't even true for philosophers that know exactly what you're asking them. So why would it be true for ordinary people that have never encountered these terms and concepts in a context where they have very low stakes and very low incentive to put a lot of thought into what you're asking them? It'd be like if you ask someone you're passing on the street, like, what do you think about quantum mechanics? Like this person, they're not going to give you a full, this thing is right. If there's not a lot of reflection and thought and effort put into the question, and the question is ambiguous, and the person isn't familiar with the terminology that you're presenting to them, the chances that their answers are informative in the way you would like them to be are, I think, negligible. And I think that this is a serious problem for this research. Just in case people aren't aware, a lot of this research is conducted online, and people are filling out surveys online on Amazon Turk. And when people hear, so Amazon Turk, so people will get paid maybe 50 cents, $1, $1.50 to fill out a survey. A lot of people think that there's no way that data is representative. It's not bad, actually. It's actually fairly representative. You get a good spread of ages and demographic characteristics. People that are on MTurk, they take it seriously. They will give you fantastic answers. But this is not the same thing as a person in a philosophy class where they have a half hour to think about what you're doing and to think about what you're asking. The context in which people are answering these questions is very different from other sorts of contexts. And you need to be mindful of that context when people are answering these sorts of questions, because the context in which a person's answering the questions can systematically vary across studies, and it can be differentially informative depending on those considerations. Anyway, that's too much stuff. Let's get back on track.
Yeah. So I guess there's a lot of ways to go in talking about some of the potential methodological issues. But I know one thing you've talked about at some length is, well, like, where are these studies being done? What sort of populations of people are sort of the objects of these studies? I know you talked about weird populations, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, and so on. And there's a presumption there that studies on these sorts of populations should generalize, but to the populations at large, right, in the world. But that's at best not obvious. So maybe you want to talk about that sort of issue, how you can generalize from these studies, and whether
Sure. So one problem with psychological research is a lot of psychological research. What you'll do is you'll take a bunch of undergraduates at a university. So it could be 200 students in an intro to psychology course at Yale or something like that, and you give them a survey. And so you find out how these people, and let's say that virtually all of these people, there's often exceptions, but the vast majority of these 200 students, say 197 of them, are between 18 and 20. So you have 18 and 20-year-olds for the most part at Yale answering these questions. And then they respond, you get a particular pattern of response, and then you say something like, people think this. People? Which people? So there's often this implicit and sometimes explicit tendency for psychologists to uncritically generalize from a population, members of some population that they sampled, to humanity as a whole, without an appreciation for whether or not the results they find for that particular population generalize to people as a whole. To give an example of just how silly this would be, imagine if I went to an atheist conference and I surveyed everybody there by asking them, do you believe in God? And I find out that 97% of them say no. Can I then say 97% of the world's population are atheists? That would be absurd. That would make no sense, because people would immediately realize, well, if you go to a place where a bunch of atheists got together, of course you're going to have a disproportionately high rate of atheism. So you cannot generalize from that population to the rest of the world. So then the question would be, well, college students, if you're looking at basic features of human psychology, like visual perception, if you look at their visual perception, can you generalize from the way that their vision works to people in the world? Maybe in some cases, yes, but there's even caveats there. So culture can even influence your findings in some pretty fundamental and rudimentary features of human physiology and psychology. Even that can vary across different populations. But if you're asking about something like people's metaethical beliefs, that's much more likely to float on top of all the underlying shared physiological and psychological apparatuses people tend to have as a sort of species typical traits that are sort of pan-cultural. It's much more likely to be the sort of thing that would be culturally specific and culturally potentially idiosyncratic. And so what you would not want to do with psychological research that looks at something like metaethics is take certain types of populations that are fairly narrow and not necessarily well representative of humanity as a whole and generalize to humanity as a whole. Fortunately, I don't think a lot of the researchers working in the psychology of metaethics have made this mistake, and there's growing awareness about the problems. Now, most of this research looks at two populations, which is MTurk. So this is people filling out surveys on Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So they're doing online surveys. And most of that is conducted with people in the United States. And their age and other sorts of characteristics can vary. The other primary population would be students, like undergraduates at colleges and universities. So those are going to be the two. There are some other studies that have looked at other sorts of populations. So the Derwin and Young paper, they did a field experiment where they were people were posing as canvassers that were collecting money for a charity, and they stopped people on the streets in Boston. So that's like people on the street. So I don't even know if they were able to gather a lot of information about those people, but that is a totally different population. Some of them have done work at schools when I conducted research. I know that the previous research was on the psychology of metaethics, and that was for children in, I think, the Boston Children's Museum is the name of the place. So there's different sorts of populations, but it's mostly people from the United States. And the thing about that is especially cause for concern is this concern about weird populations. So weird is this acronym that Henrik and a bunch of other people came up with. I actually don't know exactly who came up with the term, but anyway, I think it's the paper's called The Weirdest People in the World with a question mark in it. And if you haven't checked out that paper and you like psychology, absolutely check out that paper. It's like one of these like sort of, sorry, I'm really wobbling the camera. Let me it's one of these central papers in the field. And what they do is they come up with this idea is they say, okay, look, let's actually look at the characteristics of the populations that have been like who is being sampled in psychological research. And what they find is that the vast majority of psychological research is conducted on people with a particular cluster of characteristics. They tend to be Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And they tend to come, or at the very least, they tend to come from nations whose populations are predominantly Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that might not be a big concern if you looked at those populations and then you looked at other populations and you compared psychological research between those two groups, and you found that on like typically like weird people from weird populations are pretty representative of people from non-weird populations. Turns out this is not only false, it's like the opposite of true. It turns out people from weird populations reliably anchor one or the other end of the distribution of where people fall on a particular psychological trait. That is to say, they are the most extremely different from all the other populations. So another way of putting this is that the rest of the world's populations tend to be more similar to each other, and weird populations are the outlier. So it's not like the vast majority isn't quite capturing, I don't know their exact numbers from the paper. It would be something like, it would be almost appropriate to say almost all psychological research has been conducted on one of the most idiosyncratic and weird populations in the world. It's one of the least representative populations. And so a lot of these inferences about human psychology are actually just inferences about weird psychology. They're inferences about people from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations. So what other types of populations are there? Well, there are populations, there's East Asian societies, there are societies that have had less Western influence. And to a significant extent, a lot of this, it's going to be a matter of shades or gradations. So there are really interesting populations that there, there have been Christian missionaries that have gone around the world. There have been, people exposed to, I don't know how much I want to get into the specifics of some of these, the cultural differences, and especially because I'm not a specialist on this, but people from other cultures are not necessarily the same, and you're not entitled to presume that they're the same. So this isn't just an issue with work in metaethics. It's an issue with work in psychology in general, which is that it's typically limited in its generalizability. But there's extra stuff you could say about the psychology of metaethics. One of them, there's this great paper. Who were the people on the paper? I can't remember all the people on the paper. Sakris and Beebe, I think. So they looked at metaethics across the lifespan. And what they found is that roughly people, I believe in their late teens to late 20s, maybe early 30s, tend to be more likely to give the anti-realist responses to the disagreement paradigm, and that people that are younger and people that are older tend to give more realist responses. That is a potential issue if a lot of the research in metaethics focuses on college students, because it could give the misleading impression that people have higher rates of anti-realism than is in fact characteristic of other age groups. So that's a potential issue is age. So they looked at it across the lifespan, and they found that sort of pattern where you get this sort of realism dip and then it comes back up. So researchers are often insensitive to these concerns. Fortunately, in metaethics, they are sensitive to these concerns. They are aware of them, and people do want to do research on other sorts of populations. But the other thing is, there's going to be a big difference if you looked at like an Amish population or Mormon population. Different religious groups might be systematically different in the overall proportion of people that respond in one way rather than another way. So this is something worth being concerned with. Part of the reason is that much earlier research in developmental psychology on the moral conventional distinction found that when you looked at, say, Orthodox Jewish communities or other sorts of communities that are culturally distinct from the sort of broader populations that they're in, they would find pretty significant differences within those groups relative to the rest of the population of that country. So that more conventional stuff, when they tested it on, I think it was Orthodox Jewish populations in, was it Chicago? I'm not entirely sure, but it was in the United States. And they found that those populations responded very differently to questions that, you know, people in that are like part of, I don't know, living in New York City would not respond in the same way. They found like reliably different patterns. So that really matters. So and that's just one issue. That's just one issue, which is that it's not clear if we get a particular pattern of responses in the psychology of metaethics literature, who this generalizes to in terms of the world's population.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And it's like maybe especially an issue in metaethics, but also an issue in psychology more generally, that it might be that there's even more variability here than in other areas. And at least that's something that, you know, should be studied. You can't rule it ahead of time. I don't know. I did just have this thought though, that's like, oh, actually, there's another thing you talk about at the end of that article, I think in the conclusion, where I think you bring it up briefly, how sometimes there's like training packages in certain surveys or studies. And so people
we should get to that after we talk about the other methodological ones, because I didn't even get to those at the disagreement.
Okay. All right, fair enough.
And mostly for chronological reasons. Those are a corrective attempt to fix the problems of the disagreement paradigm.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to talk about them after.
So maybe some of the other issues with the disagreement paradigm. I mean, one thing.
So far,
yeah.
Oh, sure.
I don't know. I was going to do some stuff, but maybe it's better if you do. I was thinking like stuff about how the sort of terms are inconsistently used across studies. The stuff about how.
Yeah, that's not a problem for the studies themselves, because as long as the wording of questions is consistent across studies, it's not. But as long as it was, what researchers call it is just irrelevant to like the participants understanding the questions.
Right.
That's more of like an academic issue. But yeah, you know, this was an issue in the paper when we were publishing this paper and it was under review. Basically, we got some feedback saying something like, you know, why do you tend to use these particular terms in the paper rather than these other terms? You know, this is like, I actually think this is a better way to frame it. I don't even disagree with him. We just decided we're just going to pick a set of terms and use it consistently for our papers. In fact, since then, I think I've changed the terms that I prefer to use. So I'm guilty of my own issue. I'm guilty of the very issue I complain about other people being guilty of. Basically, the issue, this is just a separate issue, and I'll get to the Goodwin and early methodological problems that are distinctive to that particular paper and subsequent studies that rely on the disagreement paradigm, because that's like my big thing. But this just particularly got me a little frustrated. So if you go and you look at these papers, what you will not find is that across all the papers in the psychology of metaethics, that everybody will say, using these terms, I am interested in whether ordinary people are realists about morality or anti-realists about morality. That's not what they'll say. They might say objectivists versus relativists, objectivists versus non-objectivists, absolutists versus relativists, absolutists versus anti-realists. They'll use a variety of different terms. In fact, one of the papers, I remember getting back to like the editor and the reviewer or whatever, pointing this out, is that one of these papers used like one set of terms. I don't even remember what it was, but let's say it was like realism and anti-realism. And then they later cited themselves and said about their own paper, we were looking at objectivism and relativism. Like they changed the terms in citing the very paper that they wrote. So I also gave them another example to the editor of in the same paper, someone shifting the terminology in the paper and then shifting back. So they were like it'd be like if I sometimes said moral objectivism and then sometimes said moral absolutism. And if you ask me, I actually meant exactly the same thing by those. They're synonymous. But in the same paper, I'm referring it to by both. That's just confusing. Now, I'm not upset with these authors. And there's the reason I'm not upset is there's just no consensus on what the correct or appropriate terminology is. No one has sat down to agree to this. We haven't had a big convention where we've all the realists and anti-realists and everybody's fought it out. We're we all agree. We'll compromise on this is the word we're going to use for this. This is the word we're going to use. No one's ever done that. And so it still seems to be the terminological Wild West, where people are just kind of grasping at what the right ways of framing these concepts are. So that's one issue. It's just that there hasn't been enough time and enough work put into establishing terminological consensus. The other issue is that for some of these terms and some of these concepts, the concept itself can actually be broken up into one or more orthogonal distinctions from one another. So some of it is sort of necessary simplification for the purposes of asking questions. I'll make one distinction just to illustrate this point, which is that there's a difference between whether a moral claim is relative or non-relative, and whether it's stance dependent or stance independent. You can actually technically have something that is relative but stance independent, which sounds strange because I typically think of moral relativism as stance dependent moral relativism. Whether a claim is morally true or false depends on the stance of some real or hypothetical person or group. That's just how I understand relativism. But you could say that something there are certain sorts of things where if you stipulate a standard to which something is relative, then it's not the case as Joyce puts it, that I think he puts it this way, thinking makes it so. An example would be tallness. Whether a person is tall or not tall might be true or false relative to the frame of reference that you put them in, the context that they're in. So, if you put me next to a bunch of NBA players, I'm not tall. If you put me next to a bunch of toddlers, I am tall. So whether I'm tall or not is true or false relative to the context of specification where you're applying that claim. But it's not the case that it's stance dependent whether I'm tall, because it's not the case that if it were the case that everyone believed I was tall, then I would be tall, or if they believed I was not tall, I wouldn't be tall. What makes me tall or not is who I'm being compared to, not our attitudes and preferences. So you can have this notion of relativism without stance dependence. You can also have something be stance dependent but non-relative, and this is what Joyce, I think he cited someone earlier, calls a relation designating account. So this would be stuff like ideal observer theory, maybe certain types of divine command theory. And just to give a silly version, let's say we all said we're frank realists. We all believe that moral facts are determined by frank. Well, once that's true, now claims about what's morally right or wrong, once we all agree that that's true, they don't have an indexical element. It's not the case that if you say murder is wrong and I say murder is not wrong, that it could be true relative to your standards and false relative to my standards, or maybe I got this mixed around, whatever. It can't be true in a relative sense because your statements are about what Frank thinks, my statements are about what Frank thinks. It's stance dependent. Whether abortion is right or wrong does depend on Frank's stance, but it's non-relative. And so that distinction can actually come apart in practice. There is this supplemental section in the Stanford Encyclopedia where Richard Joyce lays this out super clearly. And it's just this awesome passage. It's 3 paragraphs that just perfectly lays out this distinction. And I'm constantly referencing that. It's weird to point to a supplemental section of the SEP, but it's just it's so well written. So that's a really cool thing. Maybe I should link it to people when this is posted so people could check that out because it's really good. Anyway, the point is, given that distinction, when I'm asking this question of are people relativists or not, or do they believe in moral realism or not, technically those are compatible. So because of these orthogonal distinctions, when you unpack certain terms and concepts, it makes it very, very hard to actually use consistent terminology.
Yeah, and it's I mean, it's one thing that there's this lack of terminological consensus among the experts, so to speak, but you think it's going to be any better among the general population? Plausibly, there's going to be even less consensus or even determinacy regarding how, what thoughts people would have regarding these things, if they would have any at all, right?
Yes, and this is an issue that comes up in, to my knowledge, only one study, which are what I call direct paradigms. So direct paradigms just directly ask people, do they think that morality is objective or relative, or they take a moral issue and they say something like, take the issue of abortion. do you think there's an objectively true answer to whether abortion is right or wrong? I don't remember the exact phrasing of the question used in that paper. I could pull it up if you really want the exact phrasing. Also, I'll just note, if anyone wants the exact phrasing for these questions, I'm happy to like make up a list so people could look at it, because the exact phrasing often matters. Often there are subtle issues with the distinct problems. In fact, I could talk about the new metaethics questionnaire, which I discussed at the end of the Misunderstanding Metaethics paper, after I talk about the Goodwin and Darley stuff, because that is where these subtle changes in wording really do matter, like a whole lot. Anyway, I forgot my train of thought. What was it talking about?
That question from the Fisher article.
Oh, right.
Like,
yeah, direct paradigms.
Yeah, it was put like this: should this action be allowed? Please tell us whether you think there is an objectively true answer to this question. And then they give a scale: 1, definitely no objective truth, to 7, definitely objective truth.
Yeah, I'm looking at the paper now, and you got the wording exactly right. So the question is, should, brackets, the action, whatever it would be, should the action be allowed? Please tell us whether you think there's an objectively true answer to this question. Now, the problem with that is if you ask people, so what I did is I asked people what they think it means to say that something, a moral issue, is objectively right or wrong. And I had a couple other ways that I asked in this question. But when you look at how people interpret what it means to say morality is objective, what you do not get is a clear indication that they mean stance independent. And in that paper, they're actually pretty clear that that is what they're referring to. And as far, I believe they cite Goodwin and Darley, who are very explicit that that's what they're talking about stance independence. I think they literally say like independent of minds, or they don't say stances, but mind independent, stance independent, more basically means the same thing. I certainly mean basically the same thing by those. Anyway, if you ask people what that means, they interpret it in a whole variety of different ways. What they almost never do is interpret it as stance independent. So what are some of those ways? A few people will say stuff like, "Will object," like it means that there's like the answer to that is not based on someone's bias. And that is a meaning of objective. Like one meaning of like, was the judge objective? Yes, they were very objective. That doesn't mean, did the judge make stance independently true claims? It means the judge made judgments without prejudice, without bias. Nothing wrong with that. So one of the things I emphasize, and this, I try to do this throughout my work. Sometimes I slip and I don't say this, but it's not a Freudian slip where I'm like, actually think this. It's easier to say misinterpret, but what I tend to say is unintended interpretations. Because when someone interprets objective as meaning unbiased, they didn't misinterpret what you said. What you said is underspecified and ambiguous. They interpreted what you said in a completely reasonable way. It's just not the way you wanted them to. So that's one of the ways people can interpret the notion that like there are objectively true answers, that there's an unbiased answer to the question. So if they say yes to that, that does not mean that they think that there are stance independent moral facts. It just means that they think that there's like answers to the question that aren't based on bias. Okay. Another thing people frequently say is like the idea that something is objective means that there's like a black and white answer, and or that the answer there are no gray areas in morality. And in some of the people seem it's unclear what exactly people mean by that. But if you look at people that sometimes elaborate on their answers or say a bit more, what many people seem to think by that is something like let's say like someone says abortion is wrong. When someone says that person has a black and white stance, they mean something like closer to the idea that the person's like an absolutist about it, meaning that they think that all instances of abortion are wrong, that there are no cases where abortion is not wrong. Like there are no exceptions to this abstract general moral rule. So like thinking morality is black and white would be thinking something like, if it comes to abortion, there is one answer for abortion. It's wrong or it's right. It's very cut and, like some people have used the phrase cut and dry. It's like, there is an answer to it. It's not as sensitive to context, sensitive to local circumstances. That's one element of what they mean. Another element of what they might mean in some of the cases brings in epistemic considerations, that it's clear what the answer is rather than it being unclear. I'm not sure. Neither of those things is about whether something is stance independent or not stance independent. That is a metaphysical or best a conceptual issue that's unrelated to how we would know things or how we would be justified in believing things. And it's unrelated to the issue of like generalism versus particularism or something like that. Those are orthogonal distinctions in metaethics and normative ethics that just are not reducible to or constituted by or about the question of whether there are stance-independent moral effects. So the short version of it is that if you actually look at how people interpret questions about whether morality is objective or not, explicitly using that term, and this also holds for if you ask them about whether morality is relative, they don't appear to reliably understand the terms objective and the term relative in the way that philosophers do and in the way that researchers intend for them to. And so directly asking people whether morality is objective without any context or clarification about what you're asking them is not a reliable method for figuring out whether those people think morality is objective in the sense of stance independence.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so is there something else you want to talk about in terms of methodological issues, or do you want to talk about the training package? Or sorry.
Yeah, I'll talk about the training paradigms. But so here's one of the big issues with the Goodwin and Darley study and for the disagreement paradigm in general. And there's a bunch of others. You could check out Thomas Polzler's paper on it. I'll be publishing more stuff that brings up more issues. But here's one of the big problems. When you present a disagreement between two people, so Alex thinks abortion's wrong, Sam thinks abortion's not wrong, can they both be right, or must at least one of them be wrong? In order for responses to that disagreement to reflect whether you're a realist or an anti-realist, you have to understand that disagreement is a fundamental moral disagreement. In other words, it has to be the case that the two people have genuinely conflicting moral standards. Like one of them thinks X is wrong, one of them thinks X is not wrong, and they're referring to the same X. Like they're talking about the same thing, and they have different normative stances on it. If they don't think that, then when the person says they could both be correct, they might mean something other than that. Two different positions about the same thing, like the actual same claim, could both be true relative to the respective standards of those people. So in the original Goodwin and Darley paper, they comment on that and they say, yeah, people would have to interpret this in a bona fide way. They would actually have to understand it to be like a genuine moral disagreement. And they reported like only a few people didn't interpret it that way. So what I did is I said, hey, can I have a look at that data? Because I was just skeptical of that. That seemed very implausible to me. So I've subsequently recoded that data myself. And keep in mind, this is subjective coding, and myself and my collaborator in this paper, David Moss, also coded this data. And so now we can look at like the inter-rater reliability and some other stuff. I have methodological concerns about the very things you use to assess other methodological concerns. That's too long of a conversation. So basically what I did is I took that data and I recoded it. So what I did is I went and I asked myself, for each one of these people, so sorry, I should say, I didn't even say this. For all those moral disagreements, they ask the participants in that Goodwin and Darley study, what do you think the source of this disagreement is? Like, why do you think you and this other person disagree? And so what I did is I looked at that data because people wrote out their answers to that. In order for their response to the question to be a valid measure of their metaethical views, they would have to say something like, we have different moral positions. Like pretty straightforward. It's not like a super high bar people need to meet for it to be like a legitimate, difference. If you and I disagree about whether pizza is good, and I say, well, why do you think you disagree? Like, he doesn't like pizza. I do like pizza. Like it's not complicated. And yet, when you ask people why they think people disagree, that's not typically what you get. You don't typically get people saying that. You get a whole bunch of people that give very unclear answers. It's maybe they understood the question, maybe they didn't in the way that it was intended. It's not clear. But what you do get is a whole bunch of people that interpreted the source of the disagreement in a way that seems to undermine the validity of the measure in their particular case. So the most common thing that people will do is they'll say that them and the other person were thinking about different types of scenarios. So for instance, one of the issues that Goodwin and Darley give people is a person fires a gun into like a crowd. So they take a gun and they go like pop, 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 pop into a crowd of people. And so, when the participants are answering this question, most of them are obviously, they're going to say, yeah, that's morally wrong. And then they're told a previous participant said it was morally okay. That's wild. Who would think that that's okay? So when they're asked, why do you think this person disagrees? Some people would say stuff like, well, and I think this is like an actual example that someone said. They were like, well, I was thinking of like terrorists shooting at pedestrians, and obviously that's wrong, but they might have been thinking of like the police shooting at terrorists, and then it wouldn't be wrong. So it depends on the situation, whether it's right or wrong to fire a gun. It depends on who is firing, who they're firing at, and why they're firing, so it depends on the context. So they attributed the source of the disagreement to not to one person thinks X, one person thinks not X, but one person thinks X, one person thinks Y. And of course, X and Y could both be true, but that doesn't make you a relativist. It just means you think two different claims could both be true. That's trivial. So a bunch of people interpret it that way. You had a couple people say stuff like the other person must have misunderstood the question, which is weird because, the way it works for philosophers, if you give someone a thought experiment I say, imagine there's a person that thinks it's okay to set puppies on fire. I'm stipulating that someone thinks this. You're supposed to imagine that someone does think this. It would be strange to respond with, yeah, but people don't think that. No, but they don't. No one would think that. But that would be strange if you understand the context of philosophical dialectic. But keep in mind, you're asking actual human beings to answer questions about what you told them. Now, these are not real people I don't even think they ran a previous study. These are not real people's answers. They're made up people's answers. But they're thinking this is an actual person. And so it's completely reasonable to think that if you tell me a previous participant said it was okay to flay puppies and turn their hides into lampshades, I would respond, no, they didn't. No one said that. No one said that to you. You're that's nonsense. So that's a reasonable answer. Now, not a lot of people said it was one or two people, but the bottom line is a majority of people either clearly did not interpret the question as intended, or it's unclear how they interpreted the question. So only a minority of people appear to interpret the question in the way that they intended. Now, what I've subsequently done, and I have 20 or 30 data sets on this, and I remember at last count, I looked at the exact number of open response questions that I now have in my collection, which includes both data I've run and data I've collected from other people. I have 5,912 written responses from people explaining why they answered a question about metaethics in the way that they did, how they interpreted a question, what they think someone else meant when I give them, here's another person's answer. What do you think that person means when they say that? A whole variety of different types of questions, and I've coded these. And I code them in two dimensions. Is the response a clear interpretation or not? Can I tell if they interpreted it as intended or not? And does it appear to be an intended or an unintended interpretation? That gives you four types of categories. There's clearly intended interpretations, which is researchers would ideally want to have mostly that. You want 90, 95, ideally 100%. It's not going to happen. You're always going to get a couple people that are they're not paying attention or they misunderstood, often for very good reasons. So ideally, you want a very high rate of people that clearly interpret it as intended. The big bane of these is the next category, which is clearly unintended interpretations. So it's pretty clear the person did not interpret this in the way you intended. And if that's true, that response is not valid. And if there's enough of those responses, if 70% of your participants did not interpret your questions as intended, your measure is not valid. And then you have unclear, but kind of looks like it's intended, and unclear, and it doesn't look like it's intended, but it's too unclear in both of those cases to tell. And you could collapse those into just unclear responses if you want. So what I did, and David Moss, I think, was the one that originated this quaternary scheme of coding. It allows for sort of a maximal data resolution with respect to our confidence. So if you wanted to, you could be super charitable and look at all the clearly intended and the unclearly intended, and then say, well, what's the proportion if we're being maximally charitable and saying, here's all the people that, if it even looks like they might have interpreted it correctly, we're going to give it to them. The numbers are still very low. For some of the studies, we had 2%. So for some of them, it's so low, they're not interpreting the questions as intended. And in some of the cases, we're getting clearly unintended. It can be 30%, 40%. I'd have to look at, it's going to depend on the study, but we have huge rates of it's very clear people did not know what they're being asked. So that is a very big problem for this research. Simply put, they're asking people questions and people are not interpreting those questions the way that the researchers intend. And when those rates are high enough, the study is not valid.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned there was how, at least in some cases, people will, interpret the question as if the other person you asked the question to, well, they must have interpreted differently. So what they're doing there seems to me is like allowing their background beliefs about what moral beliefs people tend to have, or at least what moral statements they would have sent to inform how they're going to interpret the question. And you could think of it as applying sort of principle of charity or something like that, maybe. And but that's not what researchers want them to do. They want them to interpret it in a particular way, and such that you almost want to make it explicit that like, and the other person interpret it in the same way that you are, or something like that. But how do you solve that potential issue? Yeah.
Well, to be fair, if we look at the Goodwin study, let me have a look at that. They have this particular set of instructions. So here's what they say. Accept only the information given and try not to introduce additional assumptions that go beyond the problem as stated. Remember also that the other person who rated these statements was instructed in the same way that you were, i.e. they were instructed to interpret the statements in as normal and non-exceptional way and to not introduce additional assumptions. So they did their best to try to minimize this type of interpretation. Didn't seem to work, and at least not work reliably for most of the participants, because you had a whole lot of people that did that anyway. So you could give people instructions like that, but that doesn't guarantee they're going to follow the instructions. So that's one thing. You could try to give people sort of guidance in the instructions that you're giving them to minimize these types of misunderstandings, and that can work to varying degrees. The problem is, and there's this really cool paper on this, even if you explicitly stipulate something and you're just like, look, we're just telling you this is the case for the purpose of answering this question, people still are just like, no, I don't accept that. And anybody that studies philosophy and has tried to have conversations at, like, I don't know, Thanksgiving dinner or something, has had this sort of frustrating experience where you'll say something like, I don't know, suppose God has a mustache. And then like, I don't know, your uncle or something, but God doesn't have a mustache. And you're like, yeah, whatever. Just imagine God has a mustache, but God doesn't have a mustache. Like they're not understanding that you're like, just imagine this, like this, like it, basically what it comes down to is like, they're like bad at like modal reasoning. They're not able to imagine possible worlds, and, or they're just refusing to, they're just stubborn. Or they don't like to consider counterfactuals. Like, what if it were the case that? And then you stipulate, like, what if it were the case that we were all peacocks? Like, people will just be like, no, but we're not though. And it's like, yeah, but like, if we were, would we have cool tails? And then people won't say, sure, if we were all peacocks, we'd have cool tails. Like, I think that this is true. Peacocks have cool tails. They won't entertain that. They'll just say, nope, we're not peacocks. So it's I mean, these are all silly examples, but that's part of the point. Is one of the things people will do is if you give them hypotheticals, many ordinary people, like, and by ordinary people, I just mean people that don't have training in philosophy. And this is going to sound like, it sounds insulting because I'm saying like they're not good at modal reasoning and counterfactual, like thinking about modal and counterfactual considerations. Yeah, I sympathize with them. They're being practical. I don't think there's anything wrong with being practical, because most people through most of their lives are trying to do practical stuff. They're not trying to engage in ridiculous, the silly stuff that philosophers do. So I'm pretty sympathetic to people going, but we're not peacocks, leave me alone. Like, this is a stupid question. There's actually research that when you like tell people in the trolley problem, like, look, if you push the person off the footbridge, it's like 100% chance it's going to stop that trolley and it's not going to hit the 5 people. 100% chance you'll save them. And then you ask people, what's the chance it'll save them? They're like, 80%. Like, they just don't accept your stipulations. So like, too bad. If you're dealing with people that are not philosophers, they're just going to, if you give them information and the information sounds like baloney, they're going to flush it out of their heads and they're going to put stuff that's more plausible in there. Now, you might be able to anchor them on the information you give them. So if I just ask people, hey, if I shove someone in front of a train, what's the probability that it's going to stop the train from hitting a bunch of people 100 feet away? They might be like, I don't know, 3%. And trains are big. It'll just smash them. Like, what's not going to stop it? So like, if you ask them, they might give a low percentage. But if you say, imagine a scenario where it's guaranteed to happen, 100% chance, now they might anchor from 100% and downward adjust and say 90%, 80%. So you might be able to get them to anchor, but you can't, like, researchers seem to operate on the assumption that like, humans are robots and you can just tell them a thing and then they'll just agree with you. And then you say, given the thing that I've made you agree with, now what? And that people are just not going to do that. People are not like that. They're not robots. and you can't treat them that way. And researchers need to be mindful of this, and they cannot base their interpretations on the assumption that people are just going to take everything you say uncritically. And again, I'm on the side of the participants in these studies. There's no reason why, if you're a normal human being trying to go about your life, that you need to uncritically accept stipulations and counterfactuals.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess there's like a few things that could be going on in those cases. Like, I mean, it might just be poor reading comprehension, but it more often might be, people sort of import some of their uncertainty in the claim that's being given to them and say like if they're not, you're telling them 100% chance, but they aren't maybe perfectly confident that that statement is true, and so that's like, oh, maybe it's 80% because I'm like not perfectly confident that maybe there's some other sort of explanation for why they would give those sorts of responses. But yeah, I guess you would want to figure out what does explain that and how to control for that. And yeah, you mentioned a couple of things there, but it sounds like a serious issue.
Yeah, and this may be related, I'm just speculating here, to this idea of substitution, which is something that comes out of the cognitive biases and heuristics literature. So if you give someone a very complex question, something that's like a computationally heavy problem, often what they might do is that instead of answering that question, like you give them the input and it's something really wild, they will say, okay, well, I don't know how to answer that question. What's an easier question I could answer as a substitute for that question? And then they'll answer that easy question and they deliver an output. And the output is actually technically an answer to the easy question, but it's treated as an answer to the complicated question. And so this could be related to part of what is happening when you're dealing with human participants. If you give them a bunch of instructions and information, and it's like too much for them to handle all of it in a very precise and formal way, they'll just be like, they'll answer it in a simpler way. And this is one of the issues with the kind of Goodwin and Darley stuff. There's a paper, I don't know how to pronounce it, in Wainrib. There's an earlier paper, and there's also subsequent papers that looked at responses to the disagreement paradigm in children. And these, I think the children were 5, 7, and 9 years old. Like they looked at age brackets. Anyway, they're young kids. Those kids, they actually asked them as well, why do you think? Like, they might say something like, this other kid thinks it's okay to pull people's hair or shove someone on the playground. Do you think that you think it's wrong? Do you think that you could both be correct, or is at least one of you wrong? And those kids pretty much always say, at least one of us is wrong. If you ask them why, what they won't say is because there's a stance independent fact of the matter. Children are not going to say that. What they will say is because it's wrong to pull people's hair. So think about that for a moment. So I'm trying to figure out if you're a realist or an anti-realist. And so I say, you think it's wrong to murder people. I say, no, I think it's morally okay. It's good to kill people. Like assassinations are awesome. Good to kill people. And so we disagree. And then I say, well, why do you think we could both be correct, or do you think one of us has to be wrong? And you say, Lynn, it's like one of us has to be wrong. You're wrong. And then I say, why? If you say, well, because murder is wrong, you're not getting a metaethical answer. You're just reasserting your normative position. I could do that. I'm an anti-realist. I could say, do you know why murder is wrong? Because murder is wrong. Like if someone disagrees with me, they're wrong because murder is wrong. That's just, it's responding to the question as though you only understand it to be a first order question about your normative moral standards, not a second order question about your metaethical standards. And in that study where they asked kids to explain their answers, is pretty much how every kid answered. So like it looks like that they just report that as like a lot of these kids are realists, but the qualitative responses actually indicate that it's unclear whether they're realists. They were just giving normative responses. So one possibility, and I think this is probably the correct possibility, is that they never interpreted the question to be about metaethics. And when you ask a child, hey, this other kid thinks it's okay to hit people, do you think you could both be right, or do you think one of you has to be wrong? They're just interpreting that like substituting the question for a metaethical question, which is weird, for do you think the other person's wrong? And the answer is, yeah, of course it's wrong to hit other people. So in other words, they're just interpreting it as like you ask them, do you think hitting people is wrong? Yes. Another person thinks hitting people is okay. Do you think they're right? No. That doesn't tell you anything about their metaethical views. So that's basically how I think those kids were interpreting that question. So I don't think we know anything about their metaethical views. And yet you have studies with children that supposedly show that most children are realists. I don't think they show anything. I don't know how to interpret those studies.
Yeah. It's because like it's tough to infer from, in general, from different answers to normative questions what their metaethical assessment is and whether they're like necessarily disagreeing there. They may be, they may not be. And that's part of it, right? Is what you're saying.
Yeah, to give a really clear example, let's say we disagree. Do you like pineapple on pizza?
Yeah.
Oh, so do I. So this is a problem. We're going to have issues in the comments, I guess. I don't know. Do you like anchovies on pizza? I'm trying to find one we actually disagree about.
No, I don't.
Okay, so I actually do like anchovies on pizza. I love anchovies. I think anchovies on pizza is good. You think it's bad. Now, if you asked me, hey, Lance, do you think that we could both be right about this? Or is at least one of us wrong? If I interpreted that as a question about like gastronomic realism, then I might say, yeah, we could both be right, because like you have your preferences, I have mine. But I might say, yeah, one of us is wrong. And then if you said, well, why? I would be like, because anchovies on pizza is good. Like, does that mean I'm a gastronomic realist? Or does it just mean I think you're wrong? It could just mean I think you're wrong. Now that might sound weird because people sometimes, because let's say I'm a relativist about food preferences, and I am a relativist about food preferences, more or less. I don't know about the semantic claim. I don't know when people say they like foods, whether they're like trying to report their subjective values, whether they're just expressing some, like maybe I'm a non-cognitivist about food. I'm not a realist about food preferences. Anyway, flag that. I have a point to make about that that we'll come back to. So remind me to make a point. Hopefully I won't forget. I'll probably forget. When you ask me that question about food preferences, now I'm losing my train of thought because of the other point I wanted to make.
You're going to bring up the John Lowe paper?
No, I wasn't going to bring that up. But yeah, he has a paper, Gastronomic Realism, that's just incredible and really fun. Have you read it?
Yeah.
Paper. Yeah. You should bring Don Loeb on and talk to him. He's awesome. If you haven't brought him on already, bring him on, talk to him if he's up for it. Anyway, so some people will say, like, let's say I'm a moral relativist. In fact, let's just forget about the food. Let's say I'm a moral relativist, and I say murder is wrong, and then you go, you're a relativist, right? I'm like, yeah. And then you're like, well, that person thinks murder isn't okay, so you have to think murder is okay for that person. No, I don't. I think it's wrong for them to murder. I think it's wrong for everybody to murder. People will sometimes mistakenly think that this is somehow like an objection, or a problem with relativism, like you're contradicting yourself. And this is because they're mistakenly mixing up the idea that you're like an agent relativist. So an agent relativist would think that what's morally right or wrong is determined by the standards of the agent performing the action. But appraiser relativism is this view that moral actions are right or wrong relative to the standards of the agent appraising the action. So if I'm a relativist and I'm an appraiser relativist, I understand that murder is wrong according to me, but it's not wrong according to that person. What that does not mean is that I actually, an agent relativist would say, if I think murder is wrong, then I shouldn't murder, and it would be wrong for me to murder. But if you think murder is not wrong, then it wouldn't be wrong for you to murder. And so now I don't have any objection to you murdering because it's actually right for you to murder. A relativist does not have to think that. They don't have to think that each person ought to act in accordance with their subjective standards. I could just think murder is wrong according to me, and you think murder is right according to you. I don't have to care what you think. I can just say, I don't care. I'm going to stop you if you try to murder. It's not a contradiction. So there's this mistake where people think that if you think moral claims are indexed in a particular way, like if you just think moral claims are indexical, that you have to be okay with people who have different moral standards than you. And that just does not follow. One mistake would be to conflate appraiser and agent relativism. The other would be to mistakenly add this sort of normative relativistic element to your understanding of the metaethical position, where you actually think that people will conflate the notion that moral claims are true or false relative to different standards with a normative claim that you should be tolerant of or respect or not interfere when other people from different cultures or with different moral standards are acting in accordance with their standards. That's a normative position. That's not a metaethical position. In other words, there's nothing morally wrong with me saying all morality is relative. I'm a subjectivist. when I say think something is right or wrong, it's only true or false relative to my standards. Everyone else has their standards. And I'm going to impose my standards on everybody else. I don't care about their standards because it could be part of your normative attitudes that nobody should murder. Nobody, like everyone should follow your standards. There's no contradiction in thinking that. So those are a couple of mistakes people make on that one. So what I wanted to bring back is way back to the start of this conversation. You made another point about why the empirical stuff matters. One of the things that I wanted to point out about that, let's see if I can remember it now. Which is that whether moral realism is true or false doesn't seem to me like it's going to turn on whether ordinary people, when they're making moral claims, intend to speak or think like moral realists. So, sometimes when people present moral realism as a position, they'll include this semantic thesis. So they'll say moral realism is this conjunction of claims. Cognitivism is true, which means that moral claims are truth apt. And then some of those moral claims are true. And then they might include an epistemic thing, like we can know at least one of those moral facts. That's like this. So there's
and
just
the stance of dependence. Yeah.
Yeah, and that their stance independent. Although you could have like minimal realism or some type of realism where they don't want to add that element. There are people that defend they don't think stance independence is necessary. In any case, yeah. So you might get like like this very robust account of realism would be cognitivism, moral claims are truth apt. Some of those claims are true. They're true in a stance independent way, and we can know what some of those moral facts are. And then you have this very robust type of realism. There's actually more stuff you could add if you really want to. So the issue with that is, well, what if it turns out cognitivism is false? Like, what if it turns out it's not the case that if you went out and asked people what they like, what if everybody was an anti-realist? Like, what if the J.L. Mackie Society takes over the world and like they kill everybody else or whatever. Like there's a cataclysm and only people at an anti-realist conference survive. It's like The Walking Dead and they're the only survivors. Now nobody speaks like a realist. Now does it stop being the case that there are stance independent moral facts? No, why would it? That's really weird. It doesn't depend on what people think. And I don't think realists think that. I don't even think that. And not a big fan of moral realism. So like how people speak or think doesn't determine whether there are stance independent moral facts. So I don't understand why realists think that's such an important thing to think. They probably, I don't know. I'm speculating, but it can't just be like an empirical claim that they're making. It might be some kind of analytic claim, like moral claims. Like I don't know. I want to see realists respond to the empirical literature on like what ordinary people think and address that. Maybe they do somewhere and I'm not aware of it. But yeah, that's another issue. There is a paper on this. I think it's by Kahan, and I think it's called Must Moral Realism Make a Semantic Claim? Something like that. That's another paper I could add to the list of things that I've mentioned that people could look into. And the argument in that paper is no, it does not require a semantic thesis. You can have stance independent moral facts without the claim that like moral claims intend to refer to stance independent moral facts or that moral claims are cognitivist, like the truth apt. You don't need those claims in order to be a moral realist. That's the argument in that paper. I pretty much disagree with that. I don't think you do. So I'm trying to make I'm trying to lower the bar for realists. I still don't think they cross it, but they don't need to beat that condition.
Because the realist can just say, like, instead of making some general empirical semantic claim, I'm using the terms in this way. I'm using them in a way that's like cognitivist, and I'm attempting to say that they're these stance independent moral facts and so on. And I think those are, at least some of those are true, and we can know that some of them are true. And then you can assess that as a view, and you don't need to check whether people are committed to those sorts of things or whatever in general.
Right. And so Don Loeb might raise some concerns about that. And one of the concerns would be this sort of changing the subject concern, which is that, this would be very much like if it turns out people talking about dogs are referring to dogs, like what you and I both know to be a dog. But then I come along and I say, okay, but I don't care what ordinary, like it turns out, like that's what they're all talking about, but I want to talk about something else. And by dogs, I actually mean like a 27-sided shape or something like that, something like totally unrelated to dogs. And I'm like, I'm saying those exist and I've got a box of them. Okay, I'm not talking about dogs anymore. I'm changing the subject. And so one concern someone might have is if we just try to jettison everything about the folk discourse and we just don't care what ordinary people are talking about when they talk about morality, then in what meaningful respect, if we're a moral realist, we're saying, well, by moral facts, I'm referring to these things. Why are those moral facts? What does that mean exactly? so I do think that there are concerns to raise there about what exactly it means. Don Loam raises some of them. I would raise a different set of concerns. My concerns with that would be related to my skepticism that moral realists in particular, but people discussing morality in general, especially in a philosophical context, if that they could offer anything even approaching a principled account of the distinction between moral and non-moral norms, my position is that they cannot do so. And what I don't mean is that they cannot provide the absolutely like rigid, sufficient, necessary conditions. I don't think that you need to offer like a perfect conceptual analysis. It's not, I don't hold anything to that standard. I don't know that anything's ever met that standard. And that's not the standard I'm talking about. I'm talking about a much lower bar. Just being able to sort of specify what you're talking about when you're talking about moral norms. At the very least, this is very crude, so I'm not going to commit to this, where you would not get substantial pushback from a significant number of competent people in the field. And I don't think anybody can give an account of morality that would be both like substantive and non-trivial and wouldn't get major pushback. So for instance, just to give one example, something someone might say is, well, moral concerns are concerns about what you should do, all things considered. They're sort of overriding normative considerations. I don't buy that. I don't buy that because I don't think it's a case that we think moral considerations always override non-moral considerations. I think sometimes prudential considerations, it's like, if philosophers are going to appeal to intuition, fine, I could do it too. Doesn't seem intuitive to me that like the moral concern about like not lying is so overriding that if it weighs against some prudential consideration about my long-term health or something, that I have to like seriously compromise my mortality for the sake of not telling like a very minor lie. That seems ridiculous to me. Now, someone might say, well, you have a moral obligation to, not be reckless with your life, whatever. They could try to put it in moral terms. I don't think that's going to be successful in a way that's not like question begging or is really trying to like pull up their own account by its own bootstraps. So the point is, I don't think people are uncritically going to accept that moral claims necessarily are like overriding of what you should do, all things considered. That's a proposal for what morality could be. I don't think there's any way, I don't think anyone's going to succeed in convincing everyone else that that's the case. So anyway, I guess my concern would be if someone wants to stipulate what they're talking about, that's fine. But a lot of arguments about like moral realism and a lot of arguments in metaethics, I think take for granted that like we all just kind of know what morality is about. And I think we should step back and reconsider that because I don't think it's at all clear what morality is about. There are a couple fantastic papers on this. One of these is Talia Wheatley and Walterson and Armstrong. They have a couple papers. Roughly, there's something like the disunity of morality and why it matters to philosophy. And what they do is they systematically assess all the ways one might try to demonstrate that there's some principal distinction between moral norms and non-moral norms. And they just say none of these seem to work. Maybe you disagree with one of those particular accounts. Maybe one of those does work. Maybe there's some account they haven't considered. There's a couple more. I'll just mention another one. Stephen Stitch has a paper called The Moral Domain, where he just says, there is no moral domain. Like he just starts the paper with that. It's awesome. And it's like 5 or 6 pages. It's in the Atlas of Moral Psychology. That is a fantastic, I just love when a paper's like 5 pages and it just gets to the dang point. That paper gets to the point. Awesome paper, definitely worth having a look at. So this isn't like my own position. This is a position a few people in the field seem to endorse. I still suspect a lot of philosophers say that's fringe, like nobody thinks that. There's a few of us. I think we got a pretty good case, and I haven't seen any good rebuttal to Stitch, and I don't think I'm going to see one. I think we're right. So sometimes the underdog position that not a lot of people endorse is going to turn out to be right, and I think this is one of those cases.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page. I mean, I was thinking about some like more general issues potentially in the philosophy of like language and term usage here, because like you might think, and I think there's some plausibility to this, that a lot of folk usage, or even usage in general, is only as, or not much more like semantically fine-grained or determinate or consistent as needed for like practical purposes, right? So you might think that when we use language and in certain contexts and so on, that usually that it's typically meant to aid in navigating the world effectively, communicating effectively, serving whatever other practical purposes we might have for that language in that context. And with that in mind, like just many of the utterances we make, the terms we use, they could just be completely silent on more fine-grained distinctions that we might make or metaphysical questions that we might ask. And like kind of forcing these metaphysical questions onto that sort of discourse might just be just completely an error. That's I don't know, maybe this is the same thing that you're kind of getting at, but what do you think about this way of thinking about it as a more general issue about language? And
yeah, I do think that that's the case. So one of the issues is that I think that philosophers have historically focused more generally far too much on language, and then secondarily far too much on semantics, and that this obsession and preoccupation with language has more or less resulted in what I consider, and this is going to sound very harsh, but in practice, basically treating language like magic and thinking that like we could figure out the fundamental nature of reality by figuring out how we use words. I find this to be absolutely bizarre. So, you know, you'll have like this what I consider to be a very kind of embarrassing period in philosophical history was this like burgeoning of the Gettier problem and the millions of iterations of that. People, you know, this is, I don't study or specialize in epistemology, and people were saying this years before I came around, but like the whole thing just spun off the rails, and there's like all these counterexamples, and we're just trying to figure out the sufficient and necessary conditions for having knowledge. I remember one of my first courses when I was like taking graduate work in graduate school of philosophy was this just course on epistemology. And I remember thinking like, hold on. So let's say we figured out the sufficient and necessary conditions for when we would say that we have knowledge. What that would seem to amount to is figuring out how competent English speakers would use the word knowledge. So here's a scenario. Would they say the person knows or the person has knowledge in these scenarios? And would they say the person doesn't have knowledge in these scenarios? We figure out exactly what the application conditions for the word knowledge are. And then we figure out like what principles regulate those application conditions. So we figure out the list of principles. And so now we know that knowledge is justified, it's true, it's a belief, and it has some other condition, like it's the result of a reliable cognitive process or whatever. So we figure that out. Now what? What do we do with that? So now we've done super duper mega linguistics, and we figured out how people use a word. And how is that action guiding to me to know that like competent English speakers use a particular word in a particular way? So people say, oh, you know, epistemology is inherently normative. It's normative. Now I know things. I don't care about how English speakers know things or not. I'm interested in the practical question of when I make decisions, what's like the probability of getting certain sorts of expected outcomes, how relevant is the information? There's going to be all these sorts of considerations that I have no idea if those are going to be captured by the principles that regulate the application conditions for competent English speakers to apply the term knowledge. I have no idea if that's going to be useful to me or not. I have no reason to assume that it is. I wanted to just start with what are my goals, and now like what epistemic practices can I utilize to achieve those goals? So I pick my target, and now I customize my account to achieve that end. And if that's a bunch of conceptual engineering and it's not conceptual analysis, fantastic. Let's do that, because it's an actually useful project that will yield useful results. Now I have the vocabulary and the concepts and the tools to make decisions that achieve my goals. Instead of epistemology focusing on that, they focused on like, how do people use a word? That's ridiculous. Who cares? I don't care how they use a word. Also, if you wanted to figure out how people used a word, why don't you ask them? Why don't you ask them how they use a word? Why would you have a bunch of people? And this is a bigger issue because, you know, here I am criticizing experimental philosophy, but at least experimental philosophers are saying, hey, you 200 students, what do you all think? And then you aggregate that and you look at the patterns. At least they're doing that. What philosophers will do is they'll say knowledge means such and such. How do you know? Because of my intuitions. Okay, well, do your intuitions generalize to other people's intuitions? And if so, how do you know? Philosophers will often rely very heavily on their own intuitions about the application conditions for a concept or a term or whatever. And in these cases, if they're generalizing to how people, how the term knowledge is applied in general, they're just basically doing psychology, like really, really terrible psychology. They're doing psychology with a sample size of 1. That's bad. Now, they might do a little better if they consult other philosophers, but lo and behold, what do they find? They all disagree with each other. And this is a group that's super duper demographically hyper mega ultra narrow. It's all the people that are self-selecting into receiving graduate training in philosophy. That group isn't just weird. It's like super weird. I don't even know what super, we could break down that acronym. They're super weird. So the chances that they happen to be representative of humanity as a whole is absurd. And you know, just to give one element of this, most of this work is published and written and thought about by native English speakers in English. And so you have this question about like, what are the application conditions of the concept of knowledge? Okay, in what language? In English? Like, are you talking about how a word is used in English? Because some languages aren't going to have perfect cognate terms. So do they even have the same kind of concept? And you know, some philosophers might scoff at that and go, well, you know, I know the word in Latin and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and German and okay, what is it in Etruscan? Like what is it in like Hittite? Do they have a word for? I don't know. I don't know if they have a word. Maybe they do. But you like, unless you're a comparative linguist with extensive knowledge of like, I don't know, Pacific Northwestern indigenous languages, how on earth could you possibly know whether they have a concept for that? You can assume, and maybe you can make some inductive case. You've looked at 500 languages, and they're in like 5 different major language groups, and it's in every single one of them. Sure, fine, make your inductive inference that all languages have it. But unless you've done that work, what you're doing is like really bad linguistics and really bad psychology. And this is, so like I could dunk on experimental philosophy all day, but traditional armchair philosophy, when they make the pretense of making claims that generalize about what concepts mean or what terms mean, it's in a much worse state of affairs. They're not entitled to those presumptions.
Yeah, a lot of interesting things you bring up there. Like, I did want to mention the one potential relevance of general usage to your own usage is that, well, you might want to kind of match your own usage to the general usage. So then you might care about how people generally are using the term and try to accord that. But you know, that's just because that's one of your goals, right? If you had some strong, that wasn't your goal in this case, or you had some other stronger goal, like I don't know, I'm using it for my own purposes, and whether I'm using it in the same way and able to, so as that I can effectively communicate with people, that's like less important. Then, you know, the conceptual engineering might be the way to go for you, right? So like,
yeah. So in that case, you're addressing a practical goal of what it's useful to do. You're not addressing what I think philosophers generally want to do in many circumstances, which is figure out like what reality is like, what's true. So if you're asking the question, how should I speak given my goals? That's a practical question. That's not a question about what is true about the world. Considerations about what's true about the world are relevant to that. So if you have the goal, I want to speak like other people speak, now you need to know about the descriptive facts. How do other people speak? So that you can match your speech to theirs. So sure, there are descriptive facts about how the world is that you might want to figure out. Turns out in a lot of these cases, those are going to be empirical questions. And just, I cannot make the point often enough that philosophers seem to be unclear about whether they're making empirical claims, in which case they're not using the right methods for figuring out the answers to those questions, or they're not, in which case I'm not sure what they're doing, and they don't seem to be very clear on what they're doing. It's just like, you know, you can read a paper on metaethics and they're saying like such and such, you know, moral claim, like people are projecting their values on the world, or they're doing this sort of thing. Which people? When? How are they doing this? What is the empirical evidence of this? Is it an empirical claim? You know, I've encountered philosophers that when I'll talk about, say, cognitivism, moral claims or truth app, and I'll say that it looks empirical, they'll say, no, it's not. It's not an empirical claim. Now, I could understand if what they mean, if they said something like, I think the proper methods for figuring out whether moral claims are truth apt or not are to use like a priori reasoning and not to conduct social scientific surveys. I don't think that necessarily means the question is an empirical. So if you're using, basically, so you can imagine something like this. Only experts in philosophy know how people actually apply concepts, and they figure it out by considering instances of people's use of language and then applying their philosophical expertise, and then they make inferences that make sense of what people are doing. and that ordinary people, you can't ask them philosophical questions in a way where they'll understand it. They're not able to think it through, so you can't just ask them the questions. So like the proper, like social scientific methods are just not going to work, because a person, you have to ensure that the person is engaged, is like linguistically competent, they understand what you're asking, blah, blah, blah. And the only way to ensure that is to engage in philosophical dialectic. This is the point that Kauppinen makes in the paper, The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy, where he says, look, if you're going to go out and survey people, if you want to be sure that they're understanding a philosophical question in the way you intend, you would have to meet all these conditions. And that's a very high bar. And the only way to really meet those conditions is to basically train the person to do philosophy. And at that point, now you're just doing philosophy. You're not like, so you would have to do like really extensive qualitative research, which would be like a super structured or semi-structured interview with enormous, like basically you'd have to do Socratic interviewing. Yeah, I don't know, maybe that's a new term. Maybe someone else already came up with it. I'm not going to claim it. Socratic interviewing. So you sit participants down and you put them through the Socratic dialogue to try to get them to give a clear answer. And once you do that sufficiently well, now you know what they think. Well, now you just did philosophy. So now your social scientific method is just importing the methods traditionally used in philosophy. So if people saying these are not empirical questions mean the only way to get at these questions is to do philosophy, fair enough. Now I'm just going to say fine. And that aspect of philosophy is addressing empirical questions. You're just using philosophical tools to address empirical questions. The questions are still empirical, and there's still going to be concerns about generalization, like whether you can generalize from the Socratic dialogue you have with one person to a Socratic dialogue you have with another person. Because you could do the Socratic dialogue, and let's say you talk to one person and you work everything out, and it turns out they speak and think like a moral realist. Do you then say, well, one person's good enough, people speak and think like realists? No. What if you go through that process with another person and it turns out they're an anti-realist, and they're a very committed anti-realist? Well, now you got two different people. So now you're doing social science. You're going to have to collect a sufficient sample size and run quantitative analysis over the group, but then you're also doing philosophy. So it could be that the solution to addressing these empirical questions is a hybrid melding of traditional philosophical methods and traditional social scientific methods into some sort of like hybrid form. This was proposed, something akin to this is proposed by, I think the authors are Nadelhoff or Namias, I'm not 100% sure, but it's a response to the Kauppinen article. So the Kauppinen article is The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. Their response, I believe, is called The Past and Future of Experimental Philosophy. And these are back in the early days of experimental philosophy. They're both fantastic papers, and they're worth checking out. But if that's the case, then it's still the case that philosophers are not entitled to generalize from just thinking about how they think. There's a term people sometimes use. It's like the mind projection fallacy. Like it's this mistake of, given the way you think, assuming that other people think the same way that you do. And you'll see realists do this a lot. So realists will say stuff like, we experience morality as a realm of objective fact, or when we see someone like kick a puppy, we see that it's wrong, we. And again, I got asked these people, and I do this a lot. Who is we? Because I don't see that. I think kicking puppies is bad, but when I see it, it's like upsets me because I think it's bad. It's stance dependent. I'm not perceiving facts out in the world. Now the thing is, maybe they are, but I'm not, or at least if I am, it's not obvious to me that I am. So a lot of realists will make this presumption that everyone has the same phenomenology. Why would we assume that people have the same moral phenomenology? Turns out there's all this, we're starting to gain awareness that not everybody has mental imagery. Not everybody has the same phenomenology in very fundamental and basic ways. Some people have synesthesia, they have sensory crossover. People's phenomenology, when you actually ask them, is quite diverse. So why would we assume phenomenology in this case is the same? And they also feel entitled to presume that their particular phenomenological profile accurately represents the world. And if yours doesn't, it doesn't accurately represent the world. I just apparently have the wrong phenomenology. Why can't I make the same move? Seems like I could. That's when you get into this debate where the empirical questions start to matter. What if people that experience morality as a realm of objective fact, like they have realist phenomenology, what if they're the outliers? That's an empirical question. So, you do have phenomenal conservatives like Mike Humer, who claims to have this phenomenology. And now, I think there's an argument to be made that they're actually making mistakes about their phenomenological reporting. They're actually making inferences about their phenomenology. and then claiming that that's part of the phenomenology, and I don't think that it is. So I actually think we could challenge whether people actually are, like if someone says, I experience it this way, I think you could be wrong about how you think you experience things. You could just be wrong about it. People aren't aware of their visual blind spots. People think that they have detailed, rich vision in their peripheral view. They don't. And it might seem that way. And we can demonstrate empirically, you're wrong. The way things seem to you are not the way that they are to you. You don't actually have access to the phenomenological information that you think you do. So I see no problem with saying there's a plausible case to be made that like people reporting realist phenomenology are actually wrong. But even if we grant that they are, they're not entitled to say that their phenomenology is the only correct phenomenology. And if I don't have the phenomenology, there's like something wrong with me. Now, there could be. Typically, though, if someone doesn't have the same phenomenology as you, you'd want to look for like physical or some sort of causal explanatory mechanism, like what explains why you have that phenomenology and why I don't have that phenomenology. And when I've talked to realists, maybe I just haven't had a good enough conversations. They don't seem very interested in that. They just seem totally fine with saying, I've got the right phenomenology, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you, or I don't even want to talk to you. Again, maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe there's a bunch of more realists that want to talk to me. But I find that really weird because to me, it seems really important to get at if people are reporting these different phenomenology. I want to know why. Why do some people experience morality that way, and why do some people not experience it that way? What's causing that difference? And if we understand the psychology causing that difference, we might be able to pinpoint, and it could go either way in principle. I don't think it's going to go against me, but it could. It could turn out that something about my theoretical commitments or background beliefs systematically impair my access to a particular type of phenomenology, or cause me to engage in a type of self-deception where I have the phenomenology, but in a certain sense, I'm not honestly or accurately representing my own experiential states. So that's possible. It's possible that I'm lying or self-deceived or confused or genuinely not experiencing it due to some sort of conceptual defect. Or it's possible that it goes the other way and that there's something off about the phenomenology of the realist. It could go either way. And this is why I think cognitive science, neuroscience, bringing in evolutionary considerations, all of this stuff is going to be very, very essential to adjudicating this dispute between realists and anti-realists. And it seems wild to me for people to not be interested in that or not care or not think that that's relevant.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it. And I think at this point, actually, we've been going for well over 2 hours now. I think I don't want to keep you all day. It's been a really excellent conversation. I think I've really enjoyed having you on, but I think we'll probably wrap it up around there if that's all right with you. Yeah,
that's really fine. This is awesome. I feel like I kind of went off talking about a whole bunch of stuff I didn't expect to talk about. I'm just kind of go and just yeah, I don't know. I hope that stuff ends up being interesting to people.
No, I definitely think it is. And yeah, thanks so much for coming on and taking my questions and giving your detailed and thoughtful responses. It's been great.